The problem is that the leadership of either party tends to try to block these types of initiatives because they view it as a threat to their power, to their stranglehold on their respective legislative bodies. So this is going to have to be a member-driven effort, and enough members are going to have to say, look, we're not going to play these games anymore. We need to advance solutions, even if they aren't the perfect solutions from our perspective.
Welcome to another episode of Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I'm Alex Trembath, your host and deputy director at Breakthrough. Thank you so much for tuning in to the season premiere of our fourth season here on Breakthrough Dialogues. The Breakthrough Institute is committed to technological solutions to environmental problems, but we also want to help create a new environmental politics for the 21st century. That politics includes us eco-modernists, but not just us, hopefully. We want to host diverse conversations around protection of nature, technological innovation, environmentalism and culture, environmental philosophy, and more. It's why we host our annual events, the Breakthrough Dialogue and Eco-Modernism event. It's why we publish the Breakthrough Journal, and it's why we do this podcast. Our episodes here are meant to start or sustain conversations around our core issues. I'd encourage you to explore our website or reach out to us if you want to learn more about a guest, a piece of writing, a subject matter, or whatever. For this episode, I spoke to Carlos Curbelo. Carlos is a former congressman from Florida's 26th congressional district. While in Congress, he co-founded and co-chaired the Climate Solutions Caucus, a bipartisan coalition of legislators that still exists today, committed to bipartisan progress on climate policy. He also introduced the Market Choice Act, which aimed to attach a price to U.S. carbon emissions that we'll talk about in this episode. During and after Congress, Carlos has been dedicated to making space for conservatives and Republicans to confront the challenges of climate change. And it's for that reason I wanted to talk to him today. As we've seen with the Clean Power Plan and the Paris Agreement, it's not obvious that policy achievements secured by one party will endure for the decades it takes to deal with the challenges of climate change. And while some, including some former guests on this show, would simply say elect Democrats, I think we would all be better served if there were at least some more room for conservatives in the climate conversation. So that's what Carlos and I talk about here. Due to technical difficulties, the audio on this episode is a little rougher, so bear with us. I want to give a special shout out to my intrepid producers Tali Perlman and Alyssa Kadaman for making this episode, as all episodes, possible and enjoyable. Carlos Curbelo, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, it's good to be with you. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Thank you for being with us. So I want to start by asking you to tell us your story, honestly. I'm really interested in how you became interested in climate change and how you decided to bring that to the U.S. Congress.
So when I ran for Congress in 2013 and won in 2014, I always knew that being from the state of Florida, environmental policy would be an important part of my work. But I confess to not having been a major climate advocate or activist. I always accepted the science. I knew it's something that we needed to take seriously, but I didn't yet fully grasp the nature and the urgency of what's happening in the world. So early in my term in 2015, my first term, I had a meeting with NOAA scientists in my office. I thought it would be a fairly routine meeting where I would just get some information, learn about the work they were doing, learn about the agency. But the more I heard these scientists and the more I saw the data and the evidence that they presented, the more I realized that I needed to lead on this issue, and that the time to start was immediately. So that's kind of how I really got motivated or pushed into action. And the first thing I did was go around to the other 246 House, because we had a very large majority at the beginning of the 114th Congress, looking for allies, for others who I could work on this issue. And I found only a handful of Republicans who were willing to acknowledge climate change, who were willing to utter those two words beyond a whisper. So that was troubling for me. And that led to the formation of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, and then we could certainly get into that. But to make a long story short, by the Congress at the beginning of year 2019, there were 45 Republicans in the House who had joined 45 Democrats in the House to not just acknowledge climate change, but recognize that in addressing it and in helping to solve this crisis, and committed to doing so through a bipartisan action. And just a few months ago, to my enjoyment, the Senate launched its own bipartisan caucus, something we had tried to get them to do for a couple years without success. So that's how I got involved with the issue, and part of the story of my work in the Congress on the issue.
There's been obviously a lot of theorizing about this from all corners, but I'm curious, like you say, we've seen a good amount of progress in the last few years, thanks in no small part to efforts like yours. Why do you think there was such resistance when you first started working on this issue as a congressman in 2014? Where do you think the sort of U.S. Republican conservative hesitance to even broach the issue of climate change comes from?
So I think there were a few inflection points over the last decades that helped it to this horrible place. And by the way, we're in a better place today for sure than we were 5 years ago. But in 1995, when I took over the Congress, the tone of politics and the tenor of politics in our country changed, and politics started becoming a lot more polarized than they had been, certainly in the period of time after World War II. So Republicans started adopting a confrontational attitude with a group that perhaps they didn't fully agree with. And in terms of the environment, this really wasn't the history of our party, because Richard Nixon signed the EPA into existence, and there are other major pieces of environmental legislation that were enacted by Republican presidents, and that many Republicans in Congress supported. But anyway, 1995 and that Republican Revolution really started eroding the bipartisanship that had existed around the issue of environmental policy. And then I think the next major inflection point or landmark event was when Al Gore, after the highly divisive 2000 election, decided to became the face of American environmentalism. And I think that a lot of Republicans still irritated or agitated by the 2000 election and everything that happened after that election, just assumed that if Al Gore was for something, that they should automatically be opposed to it. Of course, I don't blame Vice President Gore for his advocacy or for his work. However, I do wish, looking back, that he had found a Republican partner to embark on that journey with, because that perhaps would have avoided the polarization that continued accelerating after Vice President Gore kind of became the face of the American environmental movement. And then under the Obama years, our politics just became more and more polarized, and the Obama administration, of course, through the Paris Agreement and other initiatives, the Clean Power Plan, made climate change a priority, and then, of course, given the tribal nature of our politics today, many Republicans reacted. So that's why in 2015 I could only find a handful of Republicans who were willing to engage on the issue. The good news, that is changing. And to contribute to that during my 4 years in Congress, but in this last year that just passed, with House Democrats really forcing this issue and forcing it to be debated, growth we've seen on the Republican side of the aisle has been extraordinary and positive, and to the point where you had just a few weeks ago the House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy saying this is an important issue, this is an issue we cannot ignore, this is an issue that young voters will punish us if we don't act, and we Republicans are going to put together a package of bills to address climate change. That was just extraordinary for me to read that, because I experienced firsthand the resistance from Republican leadership on anything that had to do with this issue. So to hear or to read Kevin McCarthy's words on climate change becoming a priority for Republicans was very uplifting, and a sign of an important trend that we're in the midst of right now.
So you've seen historically some culpability in the polarization from both Democrats and Republicans. Obviously, a lot of your work is in pushing the Republican Party to take this issue seriously. But you mentioned Gore. You mentioned some other efforts by Democrats. What do you think the responsibility of the party in opposition, in your case, Democrats, for sort of creating and hosting space for bipartisan conversation on these issues is? You mentioned that you could imagine Gore having picked a Republican colleague with which to make his case. Are there other ways that Democratic legislators, Democratic advocates, and activists should be making space for their conservative and Republican colleagues to deal with this issue?
So I think what Democrats have to decide is whether they want to use this issue and own it so that they can attack Republicans with what is increasingly a very sharp political instrument, or if they actually want to solve this issue and build the consensus that's necessary to pass the solutions that our country and the world require. Of course, the latter is more difficult. It is not the default attitude in politics these days. And I'll give you a personal example. After I lost my election, a couple months later, I was contacted by the House Ways and Means Committee under the leadership now of Richard Neal of Massachusetts, a Democrat, someone who I got to know from my time on Ways and Means and have a good relationship with. Chairman Neal invited me to testify before his committee, which would have been extraordinary for a member that had just been defeated and left the committee to come back as a witness to help make the case to the entire committee, but specifically to Republicans, on why bipartisan climate action is important. When some Democrats in the House learned of Chairman Neal's invitation to me, they went to Steny Hoyer, the House Majority Leader, and demanded that he compel Chairman Neal to withdraw the invitation because they thought it was inappropriate for a Democratic chairman to call a Republican public figure, former member of Congress, and to give that person that kind of platform. And it's very obvious that the members who drove Chairman Neal to then withdraw his invitation to me were putting politics before the priority of solving this issue and of trying to build a consensus that's necessary to advance the solutions we need. So you're right. It's not just on Republicans, and of course Republicans have been absent from this debate for a very long time, and they should be criticized for that. I've certainly criticized them for it. But at the same time, Democrats have to do their part. And if they want to keep playing political games with this, they can. But the big losers will be all of us if the worst predictions with regards to climate change come to be true, because people didn't have the maturity or the decency to sit at a table and work out an agreement.
Yeah, it's hard to know how to confront just the structural incentives towards polarization on this and so many other issues. Obviously, you probably wouldn't expect the Democratic Party to go out and try and whip up votes for you from the public, just Democratic votes, just because you're engaging on climate change. On the other hand, you would hope that in Congress, in these other public spaces where we debate these things, that Democrats on the left would be eager to have interlocutors from the right, from Republicans, from conservatives. And, in and outside of Congress, you just don't see that as much as you would hope.
You're starting to see more of it. Chris Coons, a Democrat, very a good job of reaching out to Republicans and trying to build a coalition on this issue. He is the co-chairman with Mike Braun of Indiana of this new Senate Climate Solutions Caucus. So they're all House and the Senate who work very hard to build consensus, to find those safe spaces where members can have real discussions and eventually negotiations. The problem is that the leadership of either party tends to try to block these types of initiatives because they view it as a threat to their power, to their stranglehold on their respective legislative bodies. So this is going to have to be a member-driven effort, and enough members are going to have to say, look, we're not going to play these games anymore. We need to advance solutions, even if they aren't the perfect solutions from our perspective.
Speaking of solutions, while you were in Congress, you introduced the Market Choice Act that was your attempt to legislate around the issue of climate change. Can you tell us what were the sort of bones of the Market Choice Act and why you felt that they were appropriate instruments to deal with climate change?
So the Market Choice Act was both a policy and a political initiative. We made a lot of trade-offs in order to produce a piece of legislation that could capture people's imaginations. We introduced it in the summer of 2018, so well into the second half of the 115th Congress. We knew that it was not going to pass or get voted on, but we did want to provide a model. And when I say we, I say my team at the office and all the different stakeholders we work with. And we took a year to put this bill together. A carbon pricing bill. It would have taxed carbon at $24 per metric ton to start. That would have gone up by $2 plus inflation every year for 10 years. That included a repeal of the gasoline tax so as to not double tax gasoline and make it politically unattractive for members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, to be honest. We also repealed the jet fuel excise tax to avoid double taxation there. We would have invested approximately $1 trillion in American infrastructure, so we would have fully funded the Highway Trust Fund, invested additional dollars in infrastructure, including $50 billion designated for coastal areas like here in South Florida, Massachusetts, Delaware, other places that are extremely vulnerable to rising sea levels. We would have made coal workers whole in the sense that they would have had the option to retire with a pension or to take a pension and then find work in another sector or industry. We also invested significant dollars in research development and innovation, which we think is a major priority in this whole debate. There are some obvious solutions like pricing carbon, like clean energy or renewable energy standards, but of course, small investments in interesting and innovative technologies can also help bridge the gap or mitigate in terms of emissions. And you're seeing a lot of a lot of those investments that have been made in the past bearing fruit now, carbon capture and direct air capture and there are solutions out there, even solutions we do not know of or can imagine today. So we put some dollars to that as well. And then we had what we call a border adjustment component or tax in the bill. And that would have protected the American economy from those countries that do not take carbon pollution into account in their economy. So if countries that do not price carbon were trying to import their products, they would have had to pay a tax on the way into our country, and then American exporters who were selling their products in countries that don't price carbon would have received a credit so that their products could remain competitive in those jurisdictions. So it was big, complex legislation. It's up there on the shelf, and it's actually been reintroduced in the current Congress, the 116th Congress, by Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania. It remains, even though I'm no longer in the Congress, this legislation remains one of the options that's available to legislators, or a model for what a compromise bill on climate can look like.
Yeah, and carbon pricing is, as you say, sort of a central instrument within that legislation that, as you say, is still available to legislators today. You know, carbon pricing and emissions pricing has a sort of peculiar history, you know, going back at least to amendments to the Clean Air Act under the George H.W. Bush administration. And then there were lots of Democratic and Republican co-sponsors of emissions pricing and carbon pricing legislation until the Obama years and until the Waxman-Markey bill that advanced farther than most carbon pricing legislation through Congress and was ultimately and still is ultimately seen as a Democratic effort. So I wonder, even though it's a market-based approach, even though it has these sort of conservative bona fides at its core, what you think the sort of state of carbon pricing as a legislative tool is now when you think about that political project that you were talking about?
Well, what I would say is that members of Congress today are, especially on the Republican side of the aisle, are learning about carbon pricing, are starting to it could fit as part of the puzzle to address emissions and climate change. We have noted that Congressman Steve Scalise's resolution, which he has introduced for a number of consecutive Congresses, that explicitly opposes carbon pricing. That resolution has a record low number of co-sponsors this Congress. So Republicans are starting to open up their minds, not just to carbon pricing, but to all the different solutions that are available out there. And as a matter of fact, that resolution had received unanimous support from Republicans for at least 2 or 3 Congresses. And then the last year I was in Congress, the resolution failed to secure that unanimous report. 7 Republicans refused to support the Scalise resolution. I was one of them. So all of the trends, carbon pricing included, show Republicans just being more open to the wide range of solutions that exists out there. And I'm certainly not married to carbon pricing as the only solution, but I certainly think that it is market-based, it's transparent, it's honest, it's easy for people to understand, and it attempts to internalize a cost that everyone in our country and in the world is paying for right now.
I wonder what you think of the Green New Deal itself and conversations around it. You know, it seems that the sort of Democrats, certainly, and the environmental left broadly, have to some degree moved past carbon pricing since the Waxman-Markey failure about a decade ago. and are now not just having given up on it tactically, but are now in some circles eschewing the very idea of market-based approaches in favor of sort of more state-directed policy, sort of a la Green New Deal. And I'm not entirely sure how all that's going to shake out. You could look at a very big marquee legislative approach like Waxman-Markey or like the Green New Deal, and just note that it does sort of scare away interest who are afraid of whatever the negative side of a market-based approach at a very signature level, or of a sort of more democratic socialist facing Green New Deal type of approach might take. So again, I wonder what you think of the politics today. We hear obviously genuinely encouraging signs of progress from Republicans and from Democrats. You actually have lots of bipartisan progress in sort of lots of bipartisan cooperation on things like clean energy innovation for the most part. I wonder how you think whether downstream of Republican interest in carbon pricing, downstream of Democratic interest in a Green New Deal, how the politics will shake out in the next 5-10 years.
So I'll tell you the contribution the Green New Deal has made, and it's a significant contribution. It has helped raise the profile of this issue of climate change, environmental policy. It has attracted a lot of attention to a good thing. The more the issue is discussed, the more likely it is to be addressed in a meaningful way. When no one is talking about your issue, you have a big problem. New Deal is that it's not really a plan to address climate change and carbon pollution. It is it actually uses the issue of climate change to try to fundamentally transform our economy in nothing to do with climate change. So this housing guarantee and universal income, I mean, you can agree or disagree with these issues, but they are not directly tied to the goal and the reducing carbon emissions. So what I tell people who want to solve a problem is focus on the problem, focus on the goal. The goal is to reduce carbon emissions. Now, if we say, well, in addition to doing that, we need to solve immigration. There's nothing wrong with trying to solve immigration. I certainly tried, but it certainly deflects attention and resources from the main goal. So, having an influence on the House Democratic Caucus and on some Democratic senators, but it will not be a driving force when the time comes partisan negotiation on climate, because those who propose the Green New Deal have already expressed an unwillingness to compromise in a meaningful way, even with members of their own party. Again, and I think it's had a net positive effect on the country and on our politics because it's raised the profile of the issue. However, it's not a serious, much less targeted solution.
You say it's raised the profile of the issue, which I think is undeniable. I think between raising the profile of an issue and actually making sort of legislative and concrete progress, there's a bit of a tension. So you look at something like healthcare, you look at something like immigration. When these issues become very high profile marquee issues to the American public, it seems like they get more polarized, not less. So I wonder how you see that trade-off. On the one hand, climate change is arguably one of, if not the most important issue facing Americans and humanity, particularly in the very long term, in the way that it affects our coastlines, in the way it affects disasters and extremes, the way that it affects agriculture and cropland, and everything else. On the other hand, I see some danger possibly at least, in sort of raising the profile too much, so that the issue gets just swallowed in the same polarizing politics that swallow other things. So I wonder how you see that trade-off and that tension, and if you see sort of light at the end of the tunnel regarding the sort of hyper-partisanship that has swallowed so much, in and outside the climate conversation today.
Well, I'd say the difference between climate change and an issue like healthcare is that I think the more people learn about climate change, the more people realize how it's affecting their daily lives, the more the issue becomes visible as opposed to invisible, which is fundamentally an invisible issue because we cannot see carbon pollution usually when we look out our window. The more people learn about this issue, the more they become aware of it, the more the consensus grows in our country. And we've seen this in the polling. As people become more educated, as they follow news with regards to climate change, they express a willingness to support a meaningful action, even if that requires some personal sacrifice, like, for example, an increase in the cost of goods, or perhaps having to make investments to ensure future efficiency, whether it's solar panels or anything else. So, and this was Kevin McCarthy in his statement when he said Republicans were going to start leading on this issue, kind of that there's no avoiding this issue, that the voters are not going to take inaction for an answer. And that's more the case every day as rising generations start making up a greater share of the voting population. The imperative is going to be greater and greater. So I understand what you're saying, that when issues become extremely high profile, that tends to polarize it. The consequences and the costs that are starting to become apparent all over the country, whether it's along the beach here in South Florida or in the American heartland where farmers are struggling, or out in there, the wine industry faces challenges because of changing weather patterns. The more people learn about this, the more they understand how it affects their lives, the more they're going to come together and that the politicians in Washington and throughout the country and the world adopt responsible policies in this space.
Since leaving Congress, I wonder if you could tell our listeners what you've been up to and how you've been working on these issues in the last few years.
Well, I had a lot of fun in the years since I left the Congress. I've been able to spend a little more time at home, which is wonderful. I'm married and I have two daughters, ages 10 and 7, so it is really a great time to be home. They still want to be with me and my wife. I understand that changes in the teenage years, so that's been good. And then in terms of my professional career, I co-founded a firm called Vocero, which means a spokesperson in pretty much every Romance language, but Spanish is actually my first language, so that's why we chose that name. And it's been exciting to get to continue doing work in policy areas like climate change. So we're doing a lot of work here in terms of helping message some of the ideas that nations are trying to put out there, getting different types of solutions and ideas before lawmakers for their consideration. We've also, while I was in Congress, I did a lot of work on immigration, gun reform, trying to bridge the partisan divide there, cannabis policy reform, and I'm still active in all those spaces, and that's been it's been rewarding to realize that even being outside the system, so to speak, you can still have at least as meaningful an impact. And I certainly feel like I'm doing that these days, and it's very fulfilling.
Well, that's great to hear, and good luck going forward. Carlos Curbelo, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Anytime.
Thanks for tuning in to Breakthrough Dialogues. If you like the show, tell your friends, rate us, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or whatever platform you use. Again, this is the first episode of our 4th season, and I am thrilled to welcome all our listeners back, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in season after season, episode after episode. We're really enjoying making the show and look forward to the guests that we'll be having this season. I want to again thank my guest Carlos Curbelo and our producers Alyssa Kadaman and Talia Perlman. Catch you next time.